Hi, this is Andy. I suppose it's always been true, but especially now, perhaps more than ever, we need leaders of character, whether it's leaders of countries or organizations or project teams. Leaders of character stand out and make a difference. But is character something you can define or measure? Is it something that can be developed? We can all nod our heads about the need, rather evidence-based ways to understand it and develop it in our own lives and the teams we lead. Well, in this episode, I'm glad to tell you that you're going to get answers to those questions and more. Dr. Mary Crossan and Bill Furlong join us to talk about their new book, The Character Compass. Today, Mary and Bill will talk about what character is and actually what it's not, perhaps. They'll introduce us to their leader character framework, which is a foundational part of their book. Is integrity something you either have or you don't? Or does it depend on the situation? And how can you know your own Achilles heel, so to speak? Well, you'll get answers to those questions and so much more. It's a conversation I can't wait to share with you. Hey, quick note, I want to invite you to join our Lead 52 family. It's a global group of leaders who are committed to transforming our ability to lead and deliver. You get 52 weeks of leadership learning directly to your inbox, each lesson taking less than 5 minutes a week. That's all for free. Learn more and sign up at getlead52.com. Thanks. Hey, so let's jump into today's discussion with Mary and Bill about their new book, The Character Compass. Hey, thanks to both of you for joining us on the People and Projects podcast.
Great to be here, Andy.
Great to be here, Andy. Thank you so much for having us on your show.
Oh, yeah, my pleasure. And, you both mentioned your parents in the dedication of the book. So, Mary, let's start with you. What are some ways that you saw character demonstrated in your family life as you grew up?
Well, it's a great question. My parents both deceased now, so they can't defend themselves on these comments. But so the good news is they were. I think the reason when I got into the character work, I resonated so much is because I saw it in them. My father, probably when we're going to look at the dimensions of character, probably a pillar of strength in all of these areas. So it was pretty obvious to me that it was possible because I actually saw it in him. And we're going to talk later on about trust. People trusted his judgment. They trusted not simply because he was a competent individual, but I think they trusted his character. My mother, she had imbalances of character, but ones that are an incredible courage and transcendence and drive, ones that many people would love to have, but she lacked some temperance. So she's a very impulsive woman and one of the most creative persons I've ever met in my life. So big influence, but I could also see then sometimes the cost of what happens when you do have imbalances of character. Beautiful, wonderful person, everybody loved her, but then also ended up having a stroke late in life. And I'm pretty sure those self-induced kinds of stresses and pressures that come from lots of courage and drive and, and weaknesses in some areas like temperance can really set you up for those challenges.
Oh, I love how you even say that, because sometimes I feel like there's this pressure like, oh yeah, everything is perfect, or every family is dysfunctional to some degree, right? But you had the ability to see kind of like the good part of it, and you can learn from bad examples too, for sure. Yeah, Bill, what was it like for you?
So I think when I think about the dedication that I made to my mom and dad, and they're also deceased, I think I'd always thought, Andy, about the moral compass that sort of imbued in us and has stayed with me, I think, forever. And I think when we talk about character, the place where people tend to go, at the beginning is really around morals and ethics. And I think that they had left me with something like that because they were so strong in that regard and they had so few doubts about many of these things. But they were also people that were very human. And as Mary had described earlier, there was imbalances in character. And I think for me, one of the really attractive elements of the work when I first started talking to Mary about it was, for me, it was a way of transforming what I had wanted to see in terms of morals and ethics, and what I saw lacking sometimes in the business world and the places where I operated, is how could we actually bring the thinking around character, but above and beyond morals and ethics, to the idea of judgment, decision making, and well-being. And that's where I think, I mean, I wish my mom and dad were still alive today and I could talk to them about it, because it's the natural extension of it. And I think it expands it and makes it so much more feel like, sometimes when people start talking about morals and ethics, it feels like a lecture. I'm going to get a lecture here. And this is nothing like that at all. This is really about ways that you can enhance your own judgment and well-being at the same time, without what we would think about it, a trade-off. And it just makes it, the conversation, the discussion, not only richer, I think, Andy, but actually way more useful. And I just wish my mom and dad were alive for it today to have that conversation.
Yeah. I like how you both explained that, and let's build on that idea, Bill, because, before we talk about what character is, how about we talk about what it's not? And so what I mean by that, Bill, is what would you say are some myths or misconceptions about character? Because I think you stepped on some of that, right? About it's just morals or ethics, right? What else comes to mind?
So one of the things we sort of first bump into is that people think character is the same as personality. And then becomes, okay, so, personality, and Mary's a far better expert, so I'll look at her if I misstep. But the idea of, the big five personality traits, and how those are relatively, I wouldn't call them static, but they're difficult to move in a substantive way. Character is really around habits of being, observable habits of behavior. And those can be changed. Just as we sort of develop, bad habits, you can develop good habits. And I think, so the idea that, the first place I'd start is that, it's not personality, it's actually habits of behavior. And then that leads into the second misconception is, they can't be changed. So when I was growing up, the saying that I would hear a lot was, show me the boy at 7, I'll show you the man at 20. In other words, it's basically hardwired into you.
Right.
And the evidence is, I mean, my own personal experience, but I think Mary could also share it to the extent you wish, Mary. The evidence is completely against that. Like, there are habits that you can build. You are not doomed to who you were at the age of 20. You're not, if you're an introvert, you're not doomed to not being a leader. And in fact, the opposite might be true. And so what I love about this work is that it explains and creates the opportunity for people, no matter what environment that you've grown up into, to understand what are the critical elements of leadership, both self-leadership and those for groups, how you can enhance your well-being. And there's this, for me, a democratization almost of leadership. Anyone can learn this. Anyone can change those habits of behavior. You are not doomed to your circumstances, and you are not doomed to your personality. So those would be the two ones I'd sort of pick up right away. I don't know, Mary, if there's others that you'd like to pick up on.
Yeah, I think there's some really critical ones that, Andy, it's about like describing the proverbial elephant, that people think character is all about integrity, or it's all about drive. It's all about courage. And that leads to the next problem, which is not understanding the interconnected nature of these, such that what could be a virtue will operate like a vice. That is the cornerstone of probably the biggest problem that we all face, that nobody intends to operate in either a deficient or excess vice state. But the reality is that most of us do, operate in those states. So I think there's a misunderstanding about that. And the last one that I'd say is this kind of view that if you're operating with character, you're operating with one hand behind your back. So people do not recognize that high performance arises from elevating character alongside competence. That is the piece that we want to kind of get this, misconception out of the way, because it's been relegated into morals and ethics, and you're a good person, somebody's going to take advantage of you, but not recognizing that the horsepower around both high performance and well-being is more often around character, even more so than competence.
Yeah. Oh, I'm so glad you brought that part of it up, because I don't know if I've ever heard anybody say, well, it's just a nice to have, but really, as long as you hit your numbers, like, I don't think anybody's really said it that way, but I think it's kind of implied at times. Or I think what I feel like I've heard more often is, I get it, but you can't measure it. It's too subjective, right? And those are myths. I mean, you can't read your book without realizing, no, there are ways to go about this in rigorous in ways to understand it. Mm-hmm.
You know, Andy, what's really kind of almost alarming about this, in some ways, it's easier to measure character than it is even competence.
Right.
So you think about the people that will begin to reflect on your podcast, because how do we measure competence? We usually just look at results.
Mm-hmm.
What did somebody do? We actually never measured, did they, what was the evidence of their strategic thinking capability? Did I actually have a measure of that? Or did I just look at the results at the end of the quarter or the end of the year and presume that we had competence from that?
Right.
And then competence differs from one organization to the next organization, from one level to another level. It's really just a smorgasbord. Whereas character, these dimensions of character apply to everybody in every sector, in every part of the planet. So you get this universality that allows you some, a way that you can actually look at data more consistently on observing the behavior, assessing it, measuring it, and then looking at its predictions for performance.
Yeah, I love that. Yeah, it's so much more actionable that way. And so I guess we ought to get to, instead of what it's not, what it is. So Mary, how do you like to define character? And I'm particularly interested in the value of adding the distinction of calling it leader character.
Right. Yeah, it's, often when we're writing, we talk about leader character and then we drop it to get into character. But the reason that we use the term leader is to really flag two things. Leader for us is about the disposition to lead, not the position to lead. So we want to flag for people that the way we're entering into the whole discussion of character is to foster their capacity for that disposition to lead, to bring the best of themselves day in and day out. And by the way, this is for a teenager as well as it is for a CEO. So anybody listening would get this. What are you doing with your kids? Well, you're actually developing their character, but whoever gave us a roadmap, how do we know that we were actually fostering, this strength of character? So that's the reason that we bring the leader to augment character. And it also helps us understand the trajectory of all of the work that's been done over really thousands of years in the character space when we want to bring it into organizations. And the study, a lot of the work that we build on, Martin Seligman and Christopher Peterson, they're psychologists, some of the best psychologists in the world, really looking at character and how it helped human flourishing. It is a step, though, to bring it into organizations. You really have to have a different set of toolkits. You got to be thinking about it. So hence the leader part. Mm-hmm. The character part, just to simplify that one, it's about a set of virtuous behaviors. And there's a defined set. Again, Peterson and Seligman out of 2004 did a magnificent effort to identify a set of criteria to establish behaviors as virtuous. And it's that set of behaviors that then get revealed in the framework that we talk about in the book.
Yeah. I've kind of long believed, I guess I can say at this point, that at least in many areas, not all, but in many areas, it's not a matter of if we are something, it's when we are something. And, like I can think of some of my introverted friends that when they're with their best friends who are also introverted, they display extroverted, tendencies. So sometimes I think it's tempting to say, they have strong temperance or self-control, right? But it's not if, it's when. So Bill, I'm just interested in your take on this. In what ways is my observation true or not, that it's more when than if when it comes to the elements of character?
So I think that's exactly right, Andy. When we look at leadership, it's highly contextual. And what I love about the character framework, and I think we sometimes describe it as judgment being at the center of the framework.
Right.
And judgment is what we ask of leaders. It's what we ask of ourselves. What judgments are you making? And that's the essence of leadership. And it gets informed by each one of these different dimensions. And there's sometimes when you're in a situation where you're going to reach for, say, the dimension of courage, or you'll reach for the dimension of drive or accountability. And when you reach for it, you want to make sure that it's there. There's other instances where you'll for example, if you're dealing with a very sensitive conversation with a colleague or a subordinate or anyone that you work with, and there you'll want to reach back into humility. You want to make sure you listen, a sense of humanity to make sure that you're being empathetic. And so leadership, being something which is highly contextual, requires you to have all of those dimensions in reservoirs deep enough such that you can actually operate in this optimal fashion. If you are someone, and this happens all the time, and I would argue it happened to me over the course of my career, that some dimensions like courage and drive and accountability get privileged and almost hardwired into you over humanity and humility and temperance. Your capacity to operate in the optimal manner, because those muscles, as Mary often talks about, have not been exercised. Now, when you get into those conversations that require empathy and require listening, you fumble those. You're already thinking about your answer to the question before the person has finished asking the question. And so how could you operate optimally? And how can it not be that the person on the other side of the conversation sits there and thinks, like, they're not listening to me? And is this really a person that I want to follow and be my leader? And how much am I prepared to give to this person in this organization when I don't feel like I'm being heard? And so I think it's the idea of all of these different dimensions being important. And at some point or other, you'll need to use them. But if you've calcified into a set of behaviors, when you really need them, they won't be there, and your judgments will not be the best. And in particular, your well-being will suffer as well. I mean, who amongst us hasn't had a conversation that hasn't gone the way you would hope to, and then afterwards you think, oh my God, that was awful. And then you carry that with you for a day or two. At least hopefully you carry it with you for a day or two if something has gone wrong. And so there's also this connection to well-being when you operate at this optimal level.
Yeah.
And I would add, Bill, about this, it's a lot like, think about the muscles of the body. You pull up on a table, you're using a certain set of muscles, you're not even thinking about it, but they need to be there when you need them. You push down, it's a different set of muscles. And the fact is, we are using all of these 11 dimensions all the time. And it's this sort of flux and ebb and flow, and the question is, how strong are they? So while they're contextual, here's the big problem. For too many people, it's contingent on things, like it's up for grabs. It's like, when I'm under pressure, time pressure, all of a sudden I lose my humanity. When I'm in a situation where I'm not the smartest person in the room, or I don't think I am, I lose my courage. When the compensation system of the organization rewards me in one way, but my judgment is telling me to go another way, which wins? And too often, the context, it's not the way we want it around character being contingent, so that I'm just going to rely on those muscles of character. We actually don't have them when we need them.
It's a great way to say it, because my guess, without calling out specific companies in the interview, which you do a great job of illustrating positive and negative examples, my guess is some of the people in some of those stories showed really good character, really good integrity in there. But when they had to hit those emissions numbers, right, or when they had to do these other things, they weren't able to call on it. And I think that's something we all need to reflect on. I feel like we've hinted about the framework, but maybe we need to talk a little bit more about it so people need to get a copy of the book to get a full understanding of the framework. But Mary, how do you like to introduce the framework to people beyond what we've already done, and maybe drill in on a bit? Let's just pick two of them: temperance and integrity. Okay. So introduce us, and then let's drill in on those two.
Sure. Yeah. So for those that are listening, there are 11 dimensions. We position them in a wheel with judgment in the middle. And the thing to think about with those 11 dimensions, so you asked about integrity. Integrity would have its own set of behaviors. That's an important starting point, because a lot of people think they understand integrity, but then if we take a look at the behaviors that go along with it, then we get this kind of insight into what they are. So being authentic, candid, transparent, principled, and consistent. Yeah. And when you think about those behaviors, you go, oh, okay, I get my first inkling about why integrity is hard, because organizations value integrity. We say it's like telling somebody to run a marathon and not train for it. Because how do I become authentic, candid, transparent? And then you ask about these couplings between them, because that gives us this insight into the fact that integrity can operate in a vice state. And nobody thinks about the fact that we could have too much integrity. It's not that you want to tone it down, but the problem is that principled nature of your integrity, or that candor, or that authentic nature can just become abrasive and dogmatic in its expression, because we just stand on this, ground of this is who we are, and this is what we're about, and this is how we think about the world. So those other dimensions of character that we're talking about, like humility, humanity, temperance, become really important to ensure that integrity doesn't operate like a vice.
Temperance is a word we don't really use very often, right? But it's, I think of it as like self-control, but I seem to recall you had patience, was it? And calm and composed. And it's like those would virtues be the right word? It's like, or it's that's what we want to see in a leader, that under pressure, right? They are prudent. I seem to recall those are ones that are tied to that, right?
Yeah. And Andy, we start to get some other misconceptions about it. Bill and I were just working with a team the other day, and they kept coming back to a drive. Like, drive is so important. We can't take our foot off the gas. And temperance, for them, when people think about being patient and calm, they think about it being slow, like going slow. But it's not. It's about this ability to kind of keep a really big, if you want to call it, open cognitive capacity, heart around a clarity of thinking that you need, because our studies show that under pressure we get into the fight-flight response. And it actually compromises our judgment. We actually reduce our field of vision. And that our patience and calm is really about a steadiness that we kind of bring to it. And you can picture that in whether it's in your family or it's in the organization, when people start to get stressed, it's contagious, and now everybody goes down the drain fast. We all lose our judgment in the midst of those moments.
I wonder if I can maybe even add to that a little bit, Andy. Please. I was looking at one of your previous podcasts, and I think you'd given the example of you're sitting in a meeting, you thought things were going to go your way, and then a critical stakeholder says, well, they start to raise objections, and you can just feel inside of yourself, like, I'm getting frustrated. I thought we were done here. And there's a physiology change that occurs inside of you. And temperance is something where you're aware of it. And then secondly, you've practiced the dimension enough where you're able to sort of, as opposed to immediately react, you create that space for yourself so that you can recalibrate. And instead of reacting in a way that might really sort of mess things up, you take a step back, you take a deep breath, or in the ways that you've developed that habit, and you process that situation so much more differently. So as opposed to the reaction, what Mary just talked about, is contagious, and now the whole meeting is, everyone's like, now not only is the meeting off track from a decision-making perspective, the nature of the well-being of the room has just collapsed. If, however, as the leader in that group, you can maintain that composure, then that decision-making process changes. People feel calm, they feel safe, they feel they can speak about what it is they want to speak about without actually, raising the roof. What for me is transformative is that the leader that possesses that incremental amount of temperance to be able to address that or to react in that way fundamentally changes that meeting and its outcomes. And I think that's the power of the framework, and the power in particular of the dimension of temperance, which I think Mary has sometimes talked about as the portal through which all of the other dimensions are expressed. The transformative power is remarkable when you can actually just create that space.
I love how you keep bringing this back, Bill, to well-being, because a lot of times we think of it as just I don't know, check, they got this or whatever, but we miss the fact that you use the term contagion in the book, right? It becomes the contagion that can be virtuous way or ambitious way, right? But it ends up, it could be well-being for the situation, well-being for us individually, well-being for our teams. And Bill, let's build on some of this, because I was intrigued by the table in your book that lays out the dimensions with the virtues, but also it goes what Mary was talking about before, where there's the deficiency and the excess. And I never really thought about that, because whoever talks about having too much integrity, right? Yeah. And so let's pick two different ones, two different dimensions: courage and humility. Okay. So what are some virtues associated with them, including when there's deficiency and excess?
So I think when you think about courage and humility and deficiency and excess, there's a couple of things I'd like to sort of start with. One is that we think about the dimensions as a virtue. We often think about courage in its positive state as such a good thing. Now, of course, so courage in a positive state, when there's too much, it becomes reckless. When there's insufficient, it drifts into timidity and failing to take action. And so there's a lean that we have. And as Mary mentioned earlier, context can have a significant influence on that if you don't have strength of character. When you think about humility, it's often perceived as being in its negative state, or it's I guess in this case, it would be the excess of humility. And you feel like, as Mary said earlier, I'm not the smartest person in the room, or maybe my perspective or my view does not count. And so you start to think about that. Typically is the way that I think in most leadership settings, people look at humility and kind of think, I don't think we need humility around here. We need people that are actually self-confident. Whereas the virtuous element of humility is actually in the context of listening to everything that a person has to say. Whereas when it's in its deficient state, it drifts into arrogance. And then when you have this combination, which is a lethal combination in the couplet, which I think is responding to your question, Andy, is if you've got someone who's got an enormous amount of courage and not much in the way of humility, the humility that is necessary to calibrate and harness the courage is just not there. So you're faced as a leader with the circumstance and the situation. You've got tons of courage. We're going to go in this particular direction. I don't think I need to talk to anybody else or listen to any more views or opinions on this, because my humility is in a weakened state. And therefore, you then drift into recklessness. It's kind of like a speeding car without any brakes. And so it doesn't inform your decision making with outcomes that are suboptimal. If, on the other hand, you've got a tons of humility, but tons of courage, but your humility is in an excess state, then you're thinking, well, it's hard to actually, that combination might not go very well together in any event. But in an excess of humility, you probably start to listen too much. And I'm not really quite sure which way to go. And I'll let the conversation continue to spin around and around and around and around. And then you actually never get to the point where you start to work, you start to make progress on a particular initiative. I think that's how I would sort of describe it. I think Mary might have a bit more in the way of maybe diagnosing that, or maybe looking at that perhaps in a deeper perspective. Mary, any thoughts on how I explained that?
You explained it super well, and I think that there's some good link to research around this. We know a lot of people talk about hubris, which is, of course, a lack of humility. It has been linked to almost any significant problem decision that you want to face. So it's kind of odd that we've always known humility or lack thereof to be a problem, and yet very few people know what to do about it. I think partly because how do you start to just think about hubris, for example, in an organization? But if we look at the behaviors of humility, being self-aware, modest, reflective, curious, continuous learner, respectful, grateful, vulnerable. Those are powerful, powerful kind of behaviors. Brené Brown has done, of course, marvelous work on vulnerability in and of itself. So we think about these muscles, trying to develop that muscle of vulnerability, pretty important. And then I'd want to just maybe attach it to another great area, grit.
Mm.
So in courage, if you take a look at the behaviors of courage, being brave, determined, tenacious, resilient, and confident, well, particularly determined and tenacious, that's a lot of grit. But the research around grit has found that curvilinear relationship, low and high, not so good, right? And why? Because we've got this excess vice problem. You become, you look at the excess words on this: bullheaded, stubborn, arrogant. You go, okay, no wonder we run into trouble.
Right.
And then, Andy, we just really need to reinforce the fact that we don't want to dial anything down. Like, it's not you're going to become, call it, less stubborn about what it is you do, but you do want to build up your collaboration and your humility and your humanity, so that you've got that kind of confidence in yourself that you're actually not operating in the excess state with that kind of, determination that you bring.
If I could maybe even add to that, one more thing is that typically people who are successful and have been successful and land themselves up in leadership positions, that kind of success, at least in my experience, tends to erode humility. The world starts to tell you that there's something special about you. You've got a bigger office, you've got a bigger paycheck, you've got a bigger house, your vacations are nicer, you've got a really nice watch. And so the world starts to press on that and undermine that. And I think as leaders, one of the obligations that we have is to be aware of how important humility is, but also secondly, to be aware of that success tends to breed a certain complacency and a certain hubris. And that can actually get in the way of the decision-making and well-being that Mary referred to earlier. It's something, when I'm in Mary's class with the MBA students, I always leave them with the thought of, as you progress forward and you become successful, be perfectly aware of how the world is going to erode that dimension of humility, and you'll have to spend extra time working on that muscle because it will atrophy without you paying attention to it.
Such a brilliant insight. And I actually picked these two specifically because you share a story in the book about, I think, Bill, you were about to give a presentation. You're feeling nervous, I think it was, right? Yeah. And you thought, is this a courage issue? And Mary, would you mind sharing the story? Because if I remember right, these are the two, aren't they, in the story?
They are. And it was so interesting is that I've never been comfortable with presentations until recently. But it was something, like people always talk about, what do people fear most? They fear, speaking in public more than they fear, passing away, right? Yeah. And so I was raised in an environment, an all boys school for as long as I can remember. And it's just the idea of showing weakness was a bad idea. And then I landed up on trading floors, and the idea of showing weakness on a trading floor, or as it's again a place where weakness and vulnerability is not celebrated; it's exploited. And so you become this way. And so now when you're speaking in front of people, it's like, I can't make a mistake. If I make a mistake, people are just going to jump on me. They're going to use that against me somehow or other. I'm going to pay for that mistake.
Well, in this case, you cared so much about the material that you didn't want to make a mistake because of that, right?
Exactly. And so then you walk into presentations and your whole physiology starts to gear up. I had always interpreted that as an absence of courage. Okay. And in speaking with Mary, I don't think that's the case at all. And when I look back on my life, I've done lots of courageous things and embarked upon all kinds of acts and paths that I think you would characterize as courageous. Mary said, no, I think this is actually more of a humility issue. And just going back to the idea of vulnerability, I really don't like being vulnerable. And so I have to find ways to be in a position where I can feel vulnerable and I can experience what it's like to make mistakes, to appreciate that oftentimes gold is in those mistakes. Like there's so much to learn from mistakes. And so I began to reinterpret it, and just in the particular instance that I recount in the book is I'm heading on and I'm thinking, and I just repeated the words to myself: humble, humble, humble. I'm just here to share what I know. I think it's really important. Feels a deep sense of purpose around this. I'm not perfect. I'm going to make mistakes. And then just everything just, it's just like and my temperature just, and I, since then, Andy, it's been just a matter of continuing that practice, But also, as I refer to in the book, I also joined an improv group in Toronto. And improv is all about making mistakes, and it's all about not having a script. And it's all about, when you make a mistake in improv, actually what we do is we don't diminish it, we don't eschew it, we don't push it away. We actually, oh, there's a mistake, I'm going to find a way to build on that mistake and make it even funnier and better and more interesting. And that's a reframing of how I've thought about vulnerability and making mistakes. And so my approach, I can genuinely say now, when I approach presentations, it's not a sense of nervousness, it's a sense of excitement. And it's been reframed completely in my mind. And it began with the framework and Mary diagnosing that for me.
Isn't that cool? I love that. Now, I just feel like I have to say this, though, because, Mary, I've never had a discussion about anything close to this and someone go, man, I'm so glad we talked about this because I have a real integrity problem. So like but you could look at somebody else and go, they got an integrity problem, right? So what's an example of how a listener could try to find their own Achilles heel, so to speak?
Well, great question, because we judge ourselves on our intention and others on their behavior. So we want to start and be gentle with ourselves from the very get-go of this, is to say that, we don't intend to operate in a particular way, but how is it that we can actually discover whether or not we might be operating like a vice? I'll use myself as an example. You think about that virtuous state like walking on a balance beam, and your first thing you want to do is diagnose your lean. Are you more likely to lean to the deficient side or the excess side? Maybe you're both, which is a harder one. I'm also a golfer. It's like if you've got one miss, it's a lot easier than if you've got a two-way miss. So, but let's take the one-way miss. My example would be under decisiveness, which is a behavior under judgment. My lean is not deficiency. It's like, I am a decisive person. No doubt about it, which means I know already, diagnosis, that my lean is likely to be on the excess side. And think about this idea of, I hope that when somebody asks me my point of view, it's the beginning of a conversation, whereas they can take it as the end of a conversation because my decisiveness is so strong. So my intention, of course, is not to shut down a conversation, but the observable behavior, so the second part of this is having people who are trusted advisors for you that help you see yourself maybe a little bit differently, because of course, you change it if you knew that you were steamrolling people or they thought you were. The third part of this then is, what do you do is, in my case, because I know my decisiveness isn't going to err on the deficient side, it's what other dimensions of character do I really have to strengthen to ensure that decisiveness stays on its virtuous balance beam. And it's big stuff around collaboration. To what degree does anybody see me as open-minded, flexible, interconnected, those kinds of behaviors of collaboration? Do they see my patience and calm on temperance, or do they just go, she's agitated, she just wants the decision, it's made, it's done. So that is that kind of way of trying to figure out what your Achilles heel is. But also note, we've got a lot of tools about this. There's assessments that you can do about it. We've got the app that you've got that you can practice this. So it's not some mystery to be able to walk through this.
Yeah, I think just introduction to the tools is worth the price of the book, of tools I didn't know that were out there. So I think that's good. So, Mary, in your work with busy managers, you often start by suggesting that they consider 3 questions. So what are those questions and why are they so important?
So because character is a habit of being, you can ask yourself the question, who have I become while I have been busy doing? My life story has cultivated, this sense of who I've become. Mm-hmm. You'd asked about my family, my parents. Well, the other thing is I have 8 brothers and sisters. Who I have become on my collaboration front, how did that influence me? What was I doing? Had a big background in sports. So who have I become? Where did my drive come from? How did that develop in this particular way. A lot of your beliefs in your integrity, your principles about where did they come from? That, I had this idea that you just work hard enough, and you can succeed. But the fact is, that doesn't work for everybody. That might have worked for me, but there's not necessarily those conditions for other people. So that's the first question. Second one is present. Who am I becoming while I'm busy doing? And so most of us are in certain professions that may be having us activate on some dimensions of character while we weaken others. For me as an academic, it's no surprise that a lot of the behaviors around judgment, analytical, cognitively complex, decisive, it's like I'm working those muscles all the time. What about that patience and calm? What am I doing every single day that might be cultivating that? And then to Bill's point earlier, who do I want to become while I'm busy doing? So we can start to take hold of who do I want to be with respect to character. There's a lot of things that we end up doing, things like your obituary exercise, right? Who do I want to be at the end of the day? Think about how often those obituaries are about character. Who was this person at the end of their life? And I don't think we all want to wait till we're in the last moments and say regret. Why not take hold of it now and become the person that we want to become?
Yeah, I think that's a beautiful part of those questions. I just feel like sometimes we don't drift always to who we want to become. We show up and go, how did I get here? Right? And so those questions really kind of help us. I think it's one of the examples of inspiring and empowering parts of your book is this is not predestined. There are ways to take next steps. And, there's so many ideas, but, Bill, I think one of the powerful ideas in the book is this notion of micro moments. So how do you like to describe what a micro moment is and how this fits into our journey that we're talking about here of developing a character?
Great question, Andy. I mean, one of the things that I think we often think about is that character is sort of developed in these sort of very stressful, difficult circumstances. You go through a difficult time, for example, at school or at work. Oh, that was a real character building exercise. And all the space that exists between those big moments is you're just waiting for the next one to come up. And I think it's actually in reverse. I think what we think about is that character is actually built in these tiny decisions that we make every single day. And then it's more revealed than it is built in those moments of challenge. And so, and there's an inexhaustible supply of micro moments in any given day. And it's how you choose to be aware of those and process them. And it's everything from the example that's an easy example is you're sitting on public transit and you see someone coming in and maybe it's a young parent with a child, and you think, oh, I could stand up and give them the seat. Or you can just kind of go, I'm tired today and I don't really care. Or you can just simply ignore it altogether. That was a micro moment that you had a chance to make a conscious decision. And the decision that you make, do nothing or get up, actually starts to build up the muscle or not. Doing nothing is atrophy. Doing something is actually a moment where you can strengthen it. But it's everything from, I mean, it's just, there's so many examples. It's when you're engaged in your work and you think to yourself, I'm tired. It's like 6:30. I haven't eaten yet. This will do. And you just package up the email, you close the document. I'm done. I'm just going to send it. Or do you think to yourself, I'll pick up tomorrow morning or I'll find another spot? But you actually take that micro moment of a decision to do something in the way that your better self would want to do it. And the self that, as we were just talking about, that you aspire to be with this strength of character. There is no end of decisions that we make each and every day. And the opportunities lie in that, in terms of those choices that you make. And those choices that you make will build your character in one way or another. And it will reveal itself as being present or not present under moments of stress. And if and when it does reveal itself as being wanting under moments of stress, that is not a reason to sit down and kind of go, oh, I'm a terrible person, or, and beat yourself up. That's like, okay, got it. How can I actually learn from that and build and then sort of self-diagnose and self-prescribe that in a way that can strengthen it. Just maybe a quick tangent on that. One of the wonderful things about the work around character is that it actually has this process around being able to diagnose yourself and your character, but then also ways to work on developing it. Many of the other leadership frameworks out there are actually more along the lines of, this is the kind of person you are, or maybe this is how you show up. Character has both this prescription, this diagnosis and prescriptive element to it, so it allows you to make change. But anyway, that's how I would sort of describe these micro moments, and there is no end of opportunity to work on that.
I like that, yeah, because crises hopefully don't show up that often, but the micro moments are like, I took it from the book. There's the stimulus and there's the response, and there's that moment right there where you can do it. And I don't know if this metaphor works, but to me, it seems like there's the deposit or withdrawal that I can make, and that if you exercise the deposits, they compound like financially, and then you have more to draw on later on. I think I like the muscle idea better than the deposit withdrawals. But is that, Mary, is that along the lines of what you're talking
about? As an ex-banker, I like the deposit withdrawal, by the way. So,
Yeah, you really, I'm glad you took about that stimulus and response in the space, because that is that micro moment. And that sense for us, people treat a moment like we transact through a moment of time, but no moment is the same. And there's a depth of which you can live that moment. And part of your capacity to live moments deeply arises from your strength of character, because when you lose your accountability, or you lose your temperance, or you lose your courage, you diminish who you are in the moment. I often say to people, have you ever read a page of a book and not remembered what you read? That's that transacting through the moment. What is it that allows us in our moments with ourselves and with others, like to be interconnected, to be open-minded, to be flexible, to co-create, right? To bring that, all of those kinds of muscles that are, it's like a high-performance team then, where everybody's gone to the gym, they've done the workout, they've got those muscles developed, now we can play, now we can engage and exercise.
There's so many things I'd love to talk to both of you about, but how about we end with this? We have a lot of parents who listen to the podcast, and I'm just curious if you have any thoughts on this, of some things that parents could do to develop a culture of character in their family. It's kind of how we started the interview. I'd love to end it with it as well. Bill, any thoughts come to mind? Let's start with you.
So I think, I do think that, and Mary had referred to this earlier, that when we're raising children, and both Mary and I are parents, is, you're teaching them certain competencies, but oftentimes that really is outsourced to your school or to the coaches in your community, or whatever the case may be. What we're really trying to do is to raise people of character, people that can make the right decision all the time, that have this sense of well-being that follows them around, and a sense of being adjusted and contributing to the communities in which they live. I think it starts with the idea of awareness, of course, of the framework. The idea that historically character has been thought of being subjective and poorly defined, and Mary and her colleagues have done wonderful work in actually taking away that mystery of what actually the strength of character is. It is not a subjective construct; it's an objective construct in terms of behaviors. And then the second thing is then, as I have shared it with my children, they've each got a book. And then, the conversations that I have with my children, I will start to reframe them in terms of those dimensions. And it's the idea of, okay, I can see why you made, that particular choice and reacted that particular way. Do you see how, if your temperance was stronger, if you were more patient and more calm, that actually, you would have actually made a better choice with a better outcome? And is there a pattern in your dealings with others and yourself, and oftentimes forgiveness, right? We're often very hard on ourselves. And so forgiveness doesn't start with forgiving other people. I think it starts with forgiving yourself. And so those elements around humanity. And so I find that the depth the accessibility of the language, in particular for kids that are teenagers and older and young adults, and the sense that it's not just a bunch of ideas that we've made up. It's actually science that works. Creates a framework and a basis and a foundation for me to have conversations with my kids, as opposed to, why do you keep on losing your temper? Like, you got to control your temper. Or how come you didn't get up this morning and go to your class? Like, the conversations are so much different because, the first one is more framed in terms of temperance. The second one is probably more framed in terms of drive. Yeah. And knowing that you can diagnose that and then say, but you're not doomed to that. Like, you can actually, there's ways to actually tap into drive, through this sense of purpose. There's ways to tap into the idea of temperance. You don't have to live with this. You can change it. So that's what my thinking would be in my experience so far, Mary. I don't know if yours is different.
Oh, Andy, it's magnificent. And partly, I think when people are using character in organizations is because they found so much, kind of purchase of using it in thinking in their family. In my case, I've been very fortunate because anybody reading the book will pick up that my daughter, Corey, who did a PhD in kinesiology focusing on the development of character, and which we both developed the app, I get to watch her all of the time around this. And at one point in time, she was always a kind of a high-performing individual. Then she got into the character space, and I saw another gear in her, both well-being and performance. And I asked her, how much did she attribute that to the work on character? I thought she might have said 50%. She said 100%. It's 100%. And as a parent, had I known it earlier, I could have been a better parent around this. I'll give you an example. With her in particular, she has this immense drive, but it's a different drive than mine. And hers had this tendency, she wouldn't mind me saying this, striving for perfection, not striving for excellence. And, as a parent, she was doing all sorts of stuff, but guess what? She was into things that fed that. Ballet, golf, piano. Like, I had no idea who was she becoming while she was busy doing. She was in areas that were actually grooving her on that feeding of the perfection side of things. And what I would have done as a parent, had I known some of this, would be able to see what were the other dimensions of character that she would need to kind of pull her back and stay in the strive for excellence. She wasn't bad about it, but you could see those are things that she had to kind of course correct on in her 20s, because for 20 years, right, she was grooving a path that was actually in its vice state, not its virtuous state.
It's so interesting. And it makes me reflect on, because it kind of worked the other way too, that parents might be grooving them down a path without realizing it and missing all this other stuff. So a better understanding of the full framework would help.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, for those listening, this discussion, it just is a small taste of what's included in Mary and Bill's book. If you'd like an evidence-based guide to learn more about developing a culture of character for you, your team, your family, check out the Character Compass. I put links to the book and the book's website in the show notes for this cast. So, Mary and Bill, thank you for joining us on the People and Projects podcast.
Thanks, Andy. It's been great.
Thanks, Andy. It's been a pleasure.